Hey everyone, welcome back. Today, we're going to be diving into something, you don't see every day. It's the 2024 Homeland Threat Assessment. This report, it's straight from the Department of Homeland Security, and it's basically their yearly rundown of what keeps them up at night. You could think of it as like a threat forecast, but for the entire country.
Yeah, it's a hefty document for sure. But, they've broken it down into four main areas. You've got your public safety and security, border and immigration security, critical infrastructure security, and then threats to economic security. So, pretty broad view of what we're facing.
And one of the things that really jumped out at me from the beginning was just the sheer variety of threats that are covered in this report. I mean, obviously terrorism is still a big concern, but it seems like the landscape is shifting.
Well, absolutely. I mean, what I think is really interesting is that while those more traditional threats haven't gone away, they're being joined by this whole new wave of dangers. Things like, the rise of synthetic opioids, and then the fact that you have criminal organizations using technology in increasingly sophisticated ways.
Yeah, in fact, the report actually says that drug overdoses are the leading cause of death from any threat that they listed, and specifically fentanyl. So that's a pretty sobering thought.
It really is, and it's not even just the number of overdoses, it's how fentanyl itself is evolving. The report talks about how U.S.-based traffickers are mixing it with other substances now, like xylazine. Have you heard of this? They're calling it tranq on the street.
Tranq, wow.
Yeah, and essentially what they're doing is they're making the potency totally unpredictable, which tragically makes it even more lethal.
Right, so it's not even just knowing what fentanyl is anymore. It's you never know what it's mixed with.
Exactly. And we're seeing this unpredictability, cropping up in other areas of the report as well, especially when you look at technology and security threats.
Yeah.
Like take cyber attacks, for example. They're not just about stealing data anymore. They can actually disrupt our daily lives in huge ways.
Yeah, they talk about power grids, hospitals, even elections being targeted. It's kind of unsettling to think about how vulnerable we might be.
And what makes this even more concerning is the role technology plays, not just in carrying these attacks out, but in the information we consume. Like we're talking about increasingly sophisticated disinformation campaigns now. These are fueled by artificial intelligence, and they can create these incredibly believable fake news stories.
And yet the point is to manipulate public opinion.
It's getting harder and harder to tell what's real and what's not these days.
It really is. And that's by design. I mean, the point of this is to sow confusion and erode trust. And that can have a ripple effect on everything. We're talking, public safety to our democratic processes.
So it's like disinformation itself is becoming a weapon. Precisely, yeah. And it's a weapon that's becoming more and more potent as AI technology advances. In fact, the report even talks about how AI is making it easier for smaller groups or even individuals to launch these types of attacks.
So more players, more sophisticated tools, a whole lot of uncertainty.
Yeah, it's a complex landscape, that's for sure.
Yeah.
And it's only going to get more so as these technologies evolve.
All right, so we talked about the evolving nature of the threats, but the report breaks things down into those four main areas that we talked about at the beginning. Let's start with public safety and security. What are some of the biggest takeaways there, aside from, the dangers of fentanyl, which we just talked about?
Well, domestic terrorism, that remains a significant concern. And the report really highlights how online radicalization is often driven by conspiracy theories, the spread of misinformation, and it's a major factor contributing to this. And, it's not just online. I mean, the report cites the attack in Allen, Texas. I mean, that was a chilling reminder of how unpredictable and devastating these acts of violence can be.
Yeah, that one really hit home for a lot of people. It just goes to show that these threats can touch any community, anywhere.
For sure. And, it underscores the need for vigilance at all levels. But beyond domestic terrorism, the report also dives into some interesting shifts that are happening in terms of border security. One of the things they point out is that there's been a change in the demographics of migration. So there's a shift from those more traditional points of origin to a significant increase in individuals coming from the Eastern Hemisphere.
Now, that's not something you hear every day. What kind of challenges does that present?
Well, for one thing, it creates logistical challenges. You're processing and vetting individuals from a wider range of countries, different languages, different backgrounds. So that requires, a different set of resources and expertise.
That makes sense. It's not just about the numbers. It's about adapting to a whole new set of circumstances.
Exactly. And it's not just about the logistics either. The report actually notes that there's been a significant increase in encounters with individuals who are on the terrorist screening data set at the border.
Okay, now that's definitely something to be concerned about. And it seems like the methods people are using to cross the border are evolving too. The report mentioned Mexican cartels using drones. That sounds like something out of a movie.
It does, doesn't it? But it's very much a reality. These criminal organizations, they're constantly adapting their tactics and they're leveraging technology, like drones, to smuggle drugs and people in increasingly sophisticated ways.
Speaking of technology,
Oh, are we going there?
we are going there. Let's talk about critical infrastructure security. This is where things get really interesting, especially with the growing role of cyber attacks and AI.
It's true. It's a rapidly evolving landscape, and the report, it paints a pretty concerning picture. They're really worried about the potential for physical attacks on critical infrastructure, especially in the energy sector, because it seems that extremists are calling for this type of disruption more and more.
So not just like hacking into the power grid and causing an outage, but actual sabotage, potentially.
Exactly, exactly. And in fact, they highlight this specific example, a pro-Russia cyber group, Killnet, who claimed to have launched an attack on a U.S. airport. And I think by including that specific example, it really drives home the point that these threats are not theoretical. They are happening right now.
That's a chilling thought. And then there's that whole AI-powered cyber attack thing, which, I don't know, it just seems like a sci-fi nightmare.
Yeah, but it is a growing concern, and one that we're only just beginning to wrap our heads around. The report is particularly worried about the potential for AI to automate and scale these attacks, which would make them faster, more efficient, and even harder to detect than anything we've encountered in the past.
So it's like having a super intelligent hacker that can learn and adapt much faster than any human ever could.
You got it. It's a scary thought, and it highlights the urgent need for constant innovation and adaptation when it comes to our cybersecurity defenses. But, it's not just about protecting our physical infrastructure. It's also about protecting our economy.
And that brings us to our last section, threats to economic security. What does the report have to say about that?
Well, it's a complex topic, and they really don't shy away from it. They call out China specifically for engaging in activities designed to give them an economic edge, sometimes at the expense of the U.S.,
Okay, so we're talking more than just a trade war here.
Right, yeah. This is about, control of resources, intellectual property, and even the global supply chain.
And one of the things they specifically point to is China's new counter-espionage law update. That one raised a lot of questions for me.
It's definitely a significant development. Basically, it's a way for China to exert more control over information and activity within its borders, but it also has implications for any U.S. businesses operating in or with ties to China. They're basically saying, we're watching you, and we will take action if we think you're not complying.
Not exactly a welcoming environment for U.S. companies then. So we've got fentanyl overdoses, cyber attacks, economic espionage. Is there anything else we should be worried about?
Oh, don't forget about ransomware. That's still a major threat, and the report actually says that it's becoming even more sophisticated. They're using techniques like intermittent encryption to make these attacks harder to detect and recover from.
Intermittent encryption, that sounds like a mouthful. What exactly is that?
Well, traditional ransomware tends to encrypt all of a victim's files at once, right? But intermittent encryption, it encrypts data in intervals. So to the system, it might look like normal file activity.
So it's like a stealthier, more insidious form of attack.
Exactly.
That's not good.
Not good at all. And it highlights the need for constant vigilance and adaptation when it comes to cybersecurity.
It's a lot to take in, for sure. But I think it's really important to have these conversations, We've got to stay informed about the threats we're facing.
I completely agree. Knowledge is power, as they say. And, understanding the challenge is really the first step towards finding solutions.
Okay, so we've been, diving into the darker side of things, but the report isn't all doom and gloom, right? I mean, there's a lot of emphasis on resilience, on adapting and finding ways to mitigate these threats.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. It's not just about, identifying the problems. It's about developing solutions. And one thing that really runs through the entire report is this idea of information sharing. And not just between government agencies, but with the private sector as well, and even internationally.
Makes sense. You can't really fight something if you don't even know it's coming.
Yeah, exactly. They're really stressing the need for better communication and collaboration, because they're recognizing that these threats, they often operate across borders. You know what I mean? They don't care about traditional boundaries.
Okay, so we covered public safety and security pretty thoroughly. Let's move on to border and immigration security. What are some of the key takeaways there? besides those migration trends that we already talked about?
Well, one thing they point out is that the focus isn't just on the number of migrants crossing the border, but the methods they're using to cross. Like we talked about before, cartels are relying more and more on drones for smuggling.
Yeah, that one really caught my attention. It's not just about, like, physically making that crossing anymore. It's about getting creative with technology.
Totally, totally. And again, that's a trend we see throughout the report, this kind of like technological arms race.
Yeah.
You got the people who want to exploit our vulnerabilities and then those trying to protect us.
Which kind of brings us to our next section, critical infrastructure security. This is where things get really technical, and I don't know about you, but a little scary for me.
Yeah, no, you're right. This section really gets into the nitty-gritty of cybersecurity threats, and they are taking it seriously. The report talks about the potential for both physical and cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, especially, again, in the energy sector.
So we're not just talking about, hacking into the power grid and causing an outage, but like actual sabotage, maybe even terrorism.
Exactly. And again, they highlight a very specific example of a pro-Russia cyber group called Killnet, who claim they actually launched an attack on a U.S. airport. And I think by including that specific example, they're really driving home the point that this isn't theoretical, this is happening right now.
That's a chilling thought. And then you add on top of that the whole AI-powered cyber attack thing, which seems straight out of a sci-fi nightmare.
Yeah, it's definitely a growing concern, and one that I think we're only just beginning to even grasp. The report is particularly worried about the potential for AI to automate and scale these attacks, like making them faster, more efficient, and way harder to detect than anything we've seen so far.
So it'd be like having a super intelligent hacker, but one that can learn and adapt much faster than humans ever could.
You got it. Scary thought, and it really highlights the need for us to constantly be innovating and adapting when it comes to cybersecurity. But it's not just about protecting our infrastructure, right? We also have to protect our economy.
And that, of course, leads us to our last section, threats to economic security. What did the report have to say about that?
Well, it's a very complex topic, and they don't shy away from that. They call out China very specifically for engaging in activities designed to give them that economic edge, sometimes at the expense of the U.S.
Okay, so this is way more than just like a trade war then, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We're talking about control of resources, intellectual property, even like the global supply chain.
And one of the things that specifically point to is China's new counter-espionage law update. That one really stood out to me.
Yeah, it's a significant development. Basically, it allows China to exert greater control over information and activity within its own borders. But, and this is the important part, it also has implications for any U.S. businesses operating in or with ties to China. It's basically China saying, we're watching and we will take action if you're not in line.
Not exactly the most welcoming message to U.S. companies. So we've got fentanyl, we've got cyber attacks, economic espionage, anything else to add to our list of worries?
Oh, don't forget about good old ransomware. That's still out there, and the report says it's actually getting more and more sophisticated, using things like what they call intermittent encryption to make these attacks harder to spot and harder to recover from.
Intermittent encryption, that's a mouthful. What is that?
So think of it like this. Typical ransomware encrypts all your files at once, right? Pretty obvious, right? Intermittent encryption, on the other hand, encrypts data in intervals. So to your system, it might look like totally normal file activity.
Oh, wow. So sneaky.
Exactly. Stealthy and insidious.
Definitely not good.
Not good at all. And it really drives home the point that, we're in a constant game of catch-up with these threats. We have to constantly adapt and innovate to stay ahead of the game.
Okay, so we've covered a lot today. I mean, we've gone from drug overdoses to domestic terrorism, cyber attacks, economic warfare. It's a lot to process, but it is so important to stay informed about all this.
100%. This report, it's basically a call to action for all of us. We have to be proactive and resilient, and that means understanding what we're up against. And it's not just on the government or big corporations, it's on individuals too.
That's right. What are some things that our listeners can do to kind of protect themselves, but also, I guess, contribute to the greater good?
Well, for starters, it's about being aware, right? Understanding the tactics that these criminals and extremist groups use can help us spot red flags. We can avoid becoming victims.
So, like, if you get an email from a Nigerian prince, probably don't open it.
Exactly. But it goes beyond that. We have to be critical consumers of information. Be careful what you share online, Be on the lookout for disinformation campaigns.
And proactive in our own digital lives too, right? Like our own cybersecurity at home.
100%. Strong passwords, two-factor authentication, watching out for those phishing attempts. Those are simple things, but they can make a big difference.
And then, on a broader level, supporting policies and initiatives that prioritize national security is huge.
Absolutely. We have to make sure that our government has what it needs to address these things head on.
So, we're facing some serious challenges as a society, but it's not hopeless, right? We do have the tools, we have the knowledge. It's about using them. What are some final thoughts you want to leave our listeners with?
Going through this report, one thing that really stuck with me was how much technology is a double-edged sword.
How so?
Well, on the one hand, AI, it's at the heart of so many of these threats we're talking about, but it could also be a huge part of the solution.
So, kind of like fighting fire with fire.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the report, it focuses on the threats, right? But it also hints at how we could use AI for good. Imagine being able to, detect and prevent a cyber attack in real time, or shut down a disinformation campaign before it even gets going.
Yeah, that would be something.
Right. And I think that's where a lot of the hope lies. We just need to be smart about how we develop and use these technologies, make sure it's ethical, responsible, but the potential is huge.
Definitely a challenge for innovators, policymakers, everybody, really.
Absolutely. It's on all of us.
Yeah.
Taking responsibility for our own digital lives, staying informed, being proactive. We can't just sit back and wait for someone else to fix it.
Well said. We've covered a lot today. Everything from fentanyl and cyber attacks to, border security in China. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all this, with all the challenges out there.
It's true. It's a lot. But I always come back to that saying, knowledge is power. The more we understand these threats, the better we can prepare and protect ourselves. Having these conversations, that's how it starts.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the 2024 Homeland Threat Assessment, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away from all of this?
Stay curious, stay informed, and stay engaged. That's it. The world's changing fast, the threats are evolving, but so are the solutions. We can do this, but we have to do it together.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and a huge thank you to all our listeners for sending in this report and trusting us to, break it all down. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into, whatever's keeping the world up at night.